Hello everybody. In this video we're going to go a bit wider in that area, to the general northeast of England, and look at some unsolved murders. The first one, the murder of Tina Bell, is a pretty scary story, so settle down and let's get into it. This took place on June the 2nd, 1989. Tina lived in Crescent Avenue in Billingham with her parents, and on the day in question she had promised that she'd be home in time to sleep in the back garden with her little brother. She went out of the house at about 8:20 to visit a friend. It's possible she was a little bit upset at this point, because she'd had a small argument with her mother over money for sweets, but they had made up, and it didn't seem like a big deal. She went to her friend's house, and it seems she spent about 2 hours there. She was then later seen by her cousin, standing alone near a bus shelter in Mill Lane at the junction with Roscoe Road. Then, just before midnight, Tina visited a flat above a fruit shop on Mill Lane. At 12:30 a.m, she was seen alone near the bus stop at the junction of Mill Lane. At 1 a.m, she was sighted at the other end of Mill Lane, walking alone across the recreation ground. The very last sighting of Tina was at 1:30 a.m, walking out of Rydal Avenue across Mill Lane towards the playing field. Tina was a former pupil of Abbey Hill School in Billingham. She was described as fairly immature tomboy who tended to mix with boys and girls that were younger than her, but it does sound like she was reasonably streetwise and spent a lot of time outside the house. The following morning, Tina was reported missing and the police were called. But then, something happened that we seem to come across a lot with these cases from the 70s and 80s. The police simply decided that she must have run away. Her parents pointed out that she had no money with her, no clothes with her. She was due back at work in the following 2 days, and the whole thing was completely out of character. Nevertheless, the police seem to have stuck with this theory, at least for a while. There were then no further confirmed sightings of Tina until, sadly, 10 months later, her body was found on wasteland near the ICI chemical works. It gets worse. A medical expert said Tina's skull had been subjected to corrosive chemical action and suggested that the killer had tried to dissolve her remains in some kind of chemical bath. The police, now presumably accepting that she hadn't just run away, put out a call for anyone to check their sheds, garages, lockups, factories, businesses for any missing chemicals that they may have been storing. Nobody came forward, so the police started to look back into the case and go back to the start, the night of her disappearance. Now it seems that the night in question, the way that it was described, and the witnesses still had the same story. But this is where things get dark, because the two last witnesses to see her were one Billy Dunlop and Vince Robson. Now, in between Tina going missing and her body being found, another person was murdered in Billingham, Julie Hogg, although at this point in the story, nobody had been convicted of her murder. So now we're going to jump forward to 1994 in nearby Hebden Bridge, where a 14-year-old girl called Lindsay Reimer had been murdered. So what do these two other murders have in common with the case that we're talking about? Well, I'll tell you. Billy Dunlop and Vince Robson. Why? Because in 2006, Billy was convicted of murdering Julie Hogg, and Vince? Well, he moved to Hebden Bridge, where 14-year-old Lindsay was murdered. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Vince Robson died in 2005, but he was one of the prime suspects in the case, having known her family and worked near where she lived. On hearing of this link, one of the police who worked on the Tina Bell murder inquiry said it made his blood run cold. Both Vince and Billy were spoken to at the time of the Tina Bell inquiry, but only as witnesses. They said that they did see her, but their stories and how she left their presence varied. Vince Robson said that she had left with Billy Dunlop, suggesting that it must have been Billy that was responsible. When Billy was spoken to, he said the police should re-interview Vince if they wanted to hear the real story. Neither were ever arrested by Cleveland police in connection with Tina's death due to lack of evidence. Scumbag Billy Dunlop is due to be released from prison soon, after serving almost 17 years for the murder of Julie Hogg. He gained a parole hearing in 2022. The murder of Tina Bell continues, sadly, to be an unsolved case. The second case that we're going to look at is the mysterious murder of Paul Logan. Lured to a farm track before being attacked, the senseless murder of Paul Logan is as baffling as it was cowardly. Paul was 25, had 2 kids, and was from Blackhill, near Consett. He was working as a delivery driver for the Golden Flower Chinese restaurant in Shotley Bridge. The events take place on a snowy evening 2 days before Christmas in 1993, when an order came in for a delivery to Blue House Farm. The takeaway took the order and their phone number. As the takeaway were unfamiliar with the address, Paul phoned the customer back to get directions. The number that they had left worked, and the directions were given. Paul took the order and set off for the relatively short journey. He arrived at the farm, finding the gate from the road open, and drove up the track towards the farmhouse. But when he tried to deliver the order, the owner said that they had not ordered any food, and the call must have been a hoax. Now, anyone that has worked in delivery knows that this happens from time to time, and it was unlikely Paul was fazed by this. He got back in his car and drove back down the farm lane. When he reached the gate, however, he found it now mysteriously closed. Having to get out of his car to open it, it was believed he was then attacked. The owners of the farm became concerned later that night when they noticed his car was still at the end of the lane. They called the police. At the same time, the Golden Flower takeaway had also become concerned about Paul and why he hadn't returned, so they decided to contact his family, who were concerned and decided to set out to look for him. They went to the farm, as it was the last known delivery address. When they arrived, the police were already there. After searching the area, they found Paul's body on snow-covered farmland about 50 yards from his car at 2:15 a.m. Paul's murder left his partner and family devastated, and the 2 young children without a dad. The hoax call was placed from a nearby phone box, literally yards away from the takeaway. Witnesses saw this happening and said 2 scruffy-looking men were there, and they were seen both in and around the phone box and driving a red car. Presumably, they had waited for the call back to give directions, gave them, and then left. Then, about 10 minutes later, another witness saw a red car parked near the farm. It's believed the killers had watched Paul drive onto the Blue House farm track and then close the gate behind him, meaning he would have to get out of the car on his return. It was also discovered that Paul's car had been vandalised 3 times in the weeks before the murder. On one occasion, the words "no legs" were scratched onto the roof. Police appealed to the local community to help solve this case. They said they were keeping an open mind about why Paul was killed, and that the murder was pre-planned, well organised, and done in such a way that it was extremely unlikely that the killer was acting alone. After his funeral, vandals dealt another cruel blow to the family by damaging the headstone on his grave. The only person ever arrested in the case was one Keith Suddock, but he was released without charge, and the case went cold. 6 years after Paul's murder, Suddock was convicted of an arson attack on an Astra van belonging to his dad, and he was then jailed for 12 months for possession of explosives. Suddock claimed that police have named him as a suspect because he was friendly with notorious Tyneside gangland figures, including Viv Graham, who himself was shot dead on New Year's Eve 1993 in Wallsend, which was just 8 days after Paul was killed, and that's also an unsolved murder. In 2003, Paul's parents put up a £10,000 reward for information leading to the conviction of his killers, but tragically, both parents have since passed away without ever learning the truth about their son's death. Keith Suddock also died in 2012 as luxury apartment in the Shotley Bridge area, aged 49. Paul's family don't want people to speculate on the reasons for his murder and have been plagued with local theories for years. Absurd claims, such as that Paul was a drugs mule travelling back and forth from Europe collecting drugs, is made all the more ridiculous when you discover that Paul never even owned a passport. All the police would say on the matter was that there were a lot of people who held a grudge against Paul, but they didn't go into further detail. The reward for information was raised to £50,000 at one point, but still nobody came forward. The question keeps coming up of why would they go to such lengths to kill Paul? Such a planned attack with no known motive seems hugely over the top if it was, for example, over a family feud or a local grudge. It's entirely possible that the murderers didn't mean to kill Paul, and the attack spiralled out of control. Perhaps they only meant to hurt him, but the cold weather and darkness on the night could have led to a more brutal encounter than they bargained for. As people get older, sometimes allegiances change, so there is a chance at some point someone will come forward to explain the events of that night. But until then, this remains a cold case.